Are you considering starting a company? More specifically, what about a bootstrap startup versus a venture-backed startup? In this video, I want to talk to you about some of the reasons that launching a bootstrap company might be the perfect fit for you, and I want to share with you 11 things that I wish that I knew before launching a bootstrap startup. So, having had experience, like setting the groundwork here, I've had experience working as a founding team member in venture-backed companies and private equity companies, but also in launching a couple bootstrap startups where we were using our own cash and our own runway and figuring out how to lower our costs as much as possible. And so these are the 11 things that I've learned, and now starting up front, like my bias is towards launching bootstrap. I think there are so many advantages over taking capital. But here's the 11 things. I'm going to jump right in with the first one. So number one, this is probably one of the biggest benefits that I've seen in my experience of working in venture capital world, backed startups, and then working in bootstrap, is growing organically is a competitive advantage. So what do I mean by that? If you guys have any experience, you won't need me to elaborate on this, but having been at VC-backed startups, a lot of times they spend money like it's going out of style, and there's pressure from the venture capital firms to hire the top tier elite product managers and elite software engineers and elite marketers and spend crazy amounts of money, $100,000, $200,000 a month on crazy Instagram ads and things that really aren't adding value. And it's like, well, the algorithm needs to train and all this stuff. And so I've seen more companies go out of business from taking venture capital versus growing organically, because if they were forced to spend money like it was their own, coming out of their own checking accounts, their own 401ks, their own savings, they would have spent the money very differently on things that had higher impact. And so it sets the foundation so much differently when you are borrowing money from somebody versus taking it out of your own bank account. So growing organically is totally a competitive advantage over the forced hypergrowth that a venture capital firm will force you to go down. That's number one. Number two is, I kind of touched on this, which is spending money like it's your own versus I call it the VC shopping spree. So spending money like it's your own cash, is a competitive advantage. When you have to figure out how you're going to market your product, how you're going to make people aware of the thing that it is that you have, and you're doing guerrilla marketing, and you're writing your own blog articles, and you're going to events, and you as the founding team member, or like the person that's showing up at those events, you're the one writing the content for the blog, you're the person talking to the customers. There are so many benefits to doing that. There are so many benefits to having a lean team, right? Like I don't know how many companies I've been at, specifically my own, but also smaller teams in New York City where I'm working on a team, and it's like we were spending crazy amounts of money on MacBooks and things like brand new, and we weren't buying them from the cheapest reseller, and we could have gotten them refurbished, and we could have spent our money more wisely, so we could have extended our runway and therefore had not just more time, but had more effective budgeting to like allocate to things that were working, things that were moving the needle, like marketing. So spending money like it's your own is a competitive advantage. Number three, this is a huge one, and if you ask any seasoned entrepreneur, they'll probably tell you the same thing, which is so many entrepreneurs get started, and they see a problem. They want to address the problem. And not that there's something innately wrong with that, but you need to sell what the market wants, not what you want to create. People buy what people want to buy. They don't buy what you want them to buy. And so there's a distinction there of like, I think one of the best ways to start a company is to pre-sell a thing, right? And that's why you'll see so many coming soon pages or like waiting lists and things. They work because, and in Key Person of Influence, Daniel Priestley will talk about this a lot, of like the importance of having a waiting list and building anticipation. And it's like, if it works for Rolex, like it'll probably work for you. But also, just you get to understand your market. So many people want to build what they want to build just because they want to build it. And there's not value in that. And so many people go out of business because they're just hell-bent on building something that they see from their sole perspective. But just because you're seeing something from a unique perspective doesn't mean the market's ready to buy that thing. And I'm sharing this with you as someone that's learned this the hard way. And I talked about this in a previous video of how you need to be fixated on the thing that you're working on, but you also need to be flexible when it's time to move and pivot. And so you need to figure out how to sell what the market's asking for, what the market needs, not just what you want to create. And there's an overlap there of the thing that you're passionate about creating and what the market's actually asking for. Your job is to figure out where that nexus is. Okay. It doesn't matter what your other title is as a co-founder. So you could be a founder and then you could be focused on engineering. You could be a founder that's focused on, I've seen some founders that literally all they do is fundraise. Some founders are totally into the product. Some founders are into, maybe they're on the HR, the acquisition side of things. That they have they're founders, so they do the admin, founding, whatever, paperwork. And then they're also maybe doing a couple other roles, right? It doesn't matter what your title is as a founder. You have to understand you will always be responsible for selling and for marketing and for letting people know what it is that you're doing. If you are planning to launch a company and you have zero sales or marketing, like, it's your job to start getting good in those arenas. And like, selling is not forcing your thing down someone's throat. It's helping people make a decision that they already want to make. They just don't know that they would have a benefit of making it with your product or your service or your company. You're letting them know what you have to offer and how that's going to benefit them. It doesn't matter what your role is as a founder. It is your job to sell. Okay. The next one is taking investment as like going back to work for someone else. So again, having been on both sides of this, I've worked in coaching or consulting environments where I'm working with like a bootstrap founder or a founder that's like pre-seed, pre-investment, and it's their savings, it's their idea. Maybe they had a little bit of money from an incubator or something, friends and family, and they're thinking about getting investment. And so many times when I have this conversation, I'm like, we go through it, I'm like, you do understand that like once you take investment, it's like going back to work for someone else. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, okay, let's talk about all the possibilities. Like I've seen companies where the founder has gotten removed because he or she didn't think it was their job to sell, and they were not selling well or marketing or closing deals. And the advisory board that had 51% of the company thought that someone else would be better suited in the CEO role to distribute their product and let people know about it and close deals. And so that founding CEO was removed from their company because they couldn't cut the mustard. And so that's one example. Another example is you're up all night. I mean, like, yes, you might be able to take a paycheck once you get venture capital, whereas like going bootstrap, you might not be able to take a paycheck right away, or certainly not a big one. But you have to answer to your board. You have a group of people that are overseeing everything you do, every decision you make. And a lot of, in the VC back when I was a founding team member on a bunch of VC-backed startups, like a lot of times the CEOs, like I would watch the stuff that they would go through, the amount of stress that they would shoulder in having to make these decisions. And it's like they were convicted one way because they were close to the customer, and then some venture capital firm is telling them to do something very differently. A good example of this was worked at a real estate technology company, which was really cool. We had an awesome product, great CEO, and we were solving some really unique things. And one of the customers I was working with, they were, it was a home equity line of credit product, so people could tap into their equity so they could build a business or do things. But a lot of times, if someone can't get a HELOC, their credit is generally not good. And so this was like a unique way of people being able to tap into their equity. And so this particular person's credit wasn't great, and it was a whole long story. There was like a mother-in-law that had dementia that spent money on a credit card that impacted the family. It was unintentional. They had bad credit, and it wasn't like really their fault. They needed to get open heart surgery for a child, and so they wanted to do this go through this program with us so they could tap into their equity. And now, as you can imagine, I mean, it's like a really emotional conversation I'm having with this customer, and it's so cool, like our products being able to help them. But think about that for a second. Like someone with a 500 or 600 credit score, and then you have some investor in New York City or in Los Angeles that's telling us how we should build the company for a customer that they've never talked to when they've never probably had less than an 800 credit score in their life. And so you get stuck in this environment of, you're taking money from these investors and they're telling you how to build a company, and they might be very removed from the solution that you're solving. That's not always the case, but a lot of times it is. So just something to think about is that taking investment is like going back to work for someone else. On the heels of this is the next point, which is it's really just as hard, if not harder, than working a 9 to 5. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, if you look at the interview I recently did with 99 Counties, in that interview, the founder, he says, I don't recommend it. Like 10 out of 10 don't recommend people starting a company. Like it's not for everybody. And certainly going bootstrap is the same is within that same vein. So I think it's like a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of a person that's called to launch a company, to leave their 9-to-5 job, go into this, and then a sliver of that to have the next level of instability of like self-funding it. It's a level of craziness and stress, but you'll know what's right for you because it'll feel more like a calling than a choice. So, okay, next point is, this one is kind of unique. I don't think people realize this, but your friends and family, people in your life, they're not going to root for you forever. Now, you might hear Alex Hormozi and all these other people say, oh, people start out rooting for you, and then once you do really well, they don't want to root for you. Well, it goes the other way too. Like, if your company is going through challenging times, the first couple of years, it takes a really long time for things to start taking off, like 24, 36 months. And after a while, when you first start, everyone in your family might want to invest. They think it's the coolest thing ever. They're so proud of you. Everybody wants to put money in. And I remember us being like, no, like we don't want to, we don't want that Thanksgiving dinner, right? Like we didn't want to take people's money. We had enough runway to kind of do it on our own. And we also didn't want to dilute our ownership. But when you're 18 months in or 20 months in, and it's like, people aren't seeing like exponential results, a lot of times they won't be as excited, not necessarily just like enthusiastic, but also like as willing to invest in your company. And so think about that up front. If you know that you might need capital, but you don't want to go VC, you might want to have a plan in place for like how you're going to run a Kickstarter, or like how you're going to ask friends and family for help, or like, you don't want to wait till month 24 when you're really struggling or whatever to figure that out. You want to figure that out up front. Maybe you ask at month 6. You ask early when people are excited and enthused. That would be a good time to ask, because people will not root for you forever. They won't be excited forever. Okay, the next one is, this probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is, it will be the wildest ride, the wildest roller coaster that you ever go on. The highs will be higher than anything you've ever experienced, and the lows will conversely be the lowest lows you've ever experienced. Everything will feel so extreme. It's like going back to high school almost. And so that's just something to be leery of when you're getting into it. The wins are super high and the lows are super low. If you have a great team, this is the next point. If you have a great team, even if you fail, you'll look back fondly. And so I talked to my team of one of the Bootstrap companies that we had, and ultimately the company failed, and at the time none of us really knew that you could sell a failing company for IP and do all these other things, and it was pre-COVID, and we were doing some really interesting things with AI in the employee engagement space, and the company would be worth, there's no doubt, millions in a post-COVID world. And we look back, and when I ask any of the 3 co-founders that were there, all of them are like, yeah, that was the best time of my life. And if you were to go back, you're literally were living like paycheck to paycheck, didn't know how we were going to get, make ends meet. And the level of stress was so high. And then there was like personal crises going on of like family members getting sick, girlfriends and boyfriends breaking up, dogs that were like going through grueling deaths and all these things at that time. And I'm like, I know we weren't fond of it when we were in it, but all of us look back at it so fondly. And this goes into the second to last point, which is like, even if you fail, even if your company fails, you'll end up coming out ahead. You'll end up coming out ahead in terms of you'll be more employable if you decide to go back to work at a 9-to-5 for a while. You'll have more valuable skills. You'll have worn so many hats in launching your company. You'll have made so many connections. You'll have had so many responsibilities. You'll have crammed so much into for us, it was like 14, 16-hour workdays. And you end up living like, I always call it startup years versus corporate years, right? Like startup years there's so many more experiences that are in those years versus corporate years. And so I think you end up coming out ahead so very much. And not just I know. So many companies, when you go to work at a startup in New York City or LA or wherever, they value that experience. They value that failure. They value all the things you learned from that process on what not to do. A good analogy for this would be like, so many times in American society, we fire the employee that made the $1 million mistake, right? But it's like the employee that's never going to make that $1 million mistake again is the one that just learned the $1 million lesson by making the mistake. And so it's kind of the same thing of you will end up coming out ahead even if it fails. And so I think there's so much upside if this is something you feel called to do. The last bullet point is picking the right co-founder and founding team is as important as picking the right life partner. like literally it's that simple. It's like picking a husband or a wife. It's like almost as important as that, because you spend so much time with these people. You want to be aligned. They have access to bank accounts, passwords, things that they could do to maliciously ruin your life, but also like you just want to enjoy it, right? Like you spend so much time with these people. You get to know them, their quirks, their pros, their cons, their vices, right? Do they smoke? Do they drink? Like you get wrapped up into all of those bits and pieces of their life. And so I think things like Y Combinator's co-founder finder and certain co-founder like applications where they help co-founders find each other are really helpful, that didn't necessarily exist years ago when we were launching a company. And they're good tools, and it doesn't necessarily make it any easier, as you guys have, if you've ever experienced Tinder or Bumble or whatever. It's still really hard to find the right teammate to build a company with, because it requires a lot of trust, a lot of grit, and you've got to get to know people quickly. So yeah, that's my 11 things that I wish I knew before launching a bootstrap startup. I hope these help you. I hope you think on them, and I'll see you guys in the next one.